go to our first panel discussion here, our Strategic Sourcing Forum. I'll go through our guests. They are Carrie Uhl, who's the Chief Procurement Officer at GE Healthcare, and Rahul Garg, founder and CEO at Moglix. I will join them in just a moment, but I'll just run through exactly what we're going to be talking about today. That's the strategic sourcing being a critical component of supply chain management that aims to identify the right suppliers, of course, negotiate the best terms and conditions, and ultimately improve the bottom line for an organisation. This panel is all about exploring those key factors that make sourcing strategic, its benefits and its challenges, as well as best practices and trends in the field. So Carrie Uhl, how are you?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. Very excited for this conversation.
Excellent stuff. Rahul, good to see you as well. You well?
Yes, doing well. I think looking forward to the session. I think a very relevant topic in today's time.
Absolutely right. Well, let's start with the broadest possible question I should start with, because let's focus on it, talking about strategic sourcing. So in terms of the latest trends that you've both seen when it comes to strategic sourcing, where are they at the moment? What insight do you have on that?
Sure, maybe I can start. I think one of the challenges that folks have today in trying to build out a strategic sourcing organization is balancing all of the different things that can be at odds with each other. So, the last several years have really shown a light on the need to be more resilient. I think that's a word we're all tired of hearing and saying, but it's not going away. So, when we look at supply chains, you've got to be dual sourced as much as you can. You need to be regionalized as much as you can, and you need to be sustainable, all while driving cost out. And to do all of those things at the same time is really difficult in a balancing act. And I think that's where most of my peers that I speak with, we're all trying to figure out how to do all of those things at the same time.
A small challenge. Rahul?
No, I think Carrie made some interesting point. To add on that, I would think that there are two dimensions which I would say there is a pre-pandemic world and a post-pandemic world, which also is introducing a new complexity and needs to be very much there at the heart of strategic sourcing. The first one being there is a geopolitical change in the world, which means that you have to really, really think about how is cost the only parameter of driving the strategic sourcing, or you got to be sometimes even not necessarily cost optimized, but risk optimized, as I call it, because you might be happy with the lowest cost, but your supply chain may be shut down. Or you may have situations which none of us like in terms of conflicts and wars, and which may have impact on your supply chain. So I think the concept of cost alone optimization has been probably rebalanced in a post-pandemic world with a risk optimized framework. And the second thing I want to point out, and I know there is a lot of talk about it, but AI has really moved this year away from being a buzzword or something we'll see in the future to it is here now. And I think it is going to have a profound impact on how we all suddenly start to use completely different set of tools, set of capabilities which can transform the way we do contracting with the suppliers, the way we kind of discover suppliers, the way we are able to predict things. So I think outside of the points that Carrie said, I think these two are very different dynamics that I think we had never experienced historically, and they are going to change procurement forever as we know it in the coming years.
Well, I think between you there, you've set this conversation up beautifully, because we've covered off so many key touch points there. Carrie going through all the different sometimes competing factors that you're trying to be strategic about, which sometimes push against each other. Rahul talking about the geopolitical situation, the ultimate A/B test with COVID and the pandemic. There is so much to dig into, but what I will do is I will start with AI, if I can, that you mentioned there, Rahul, because it is something that is going to keep coming up today. When it comes to use of that strategically, how do you feel that plugs into people's operations now? Is it something that we're only just starting to realise the potential of? Carrie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think organizations are just learning, as you said, what is the potential. I mean, you can use AI and price prediction analytics. We can use it to figure out where inventory needs to be at the right time. There's so many applications, and I think a lot of people were, up until this year, as you said, Rahul, kind of mystified by it, and it became, something that was a buzzword or only the most advanced companies are doing, and it's definitely starting to make its way into many, many organizations. But I think it's a learning curve, and with any new technology, it's best to start small. Pick one area that you're going to really focus and invest, get some wins, show some successes, and then expand. And I think for most companies, that's where we're at right now, is in that exploration phase and pilot phase with a small project to show the benefits.
Rahul, anything you'd add to that?
No, I think, I might be a slightly biased. I spent a lot of years at Google, and I, during this visit, happened to speak to some of the cutting edge guys. And I would say that, firstly, the change has become real, and it is going to happen faster. Now, it will happen faster in the consumer world versus the procurement world, because I think typically the adoption of technology is slower in a B2B and a procurement context. But I'll just give like a couple of ramifications I see 3 years out that I pretty much see it happening. Firstly, I mean, you will start to have completely sort of every organization has to think of really up-leveling their data systems, because I think in past we have had poor data, taxonomies. I mean, many of these issues which have not necessarily been fully solved. And I think AI feeds on data, right? I mean, so data perfection is like going to be like a super important thing for every procurement organization which wants to become smart. The second thing is, I think we will start to see this transformation happen a lot in retail, and depending on the industry you're touching. Like, what is the SKU that should be on the shelf? I think AI will start to generate that answer faster. Therefore, what does it mean in terms of your inventory levels in your warehouse? What should be the agility of your procurement function? I've always believed that over the next few years, the agility of procurement will continue to multiply, because one of the biggest challenges procurement guys always try to solve is, how do I do forecasting? How do I do inventory management? How do I, are my contracts agile enough for a fortnightly shakeup? Are they agile enough for quarterly? Are they agile enough for 6 monthly? And I think that agility will continue to become super fast, and which means better inventory optimized, better prediction of SKUs to be sold, better prediction of what's lying in the shelf of retailers, wholesalers, so on and so forth. And it is coming faster than I would think we would have imagined in past.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'd love to pick up on the differentiation that you made there, I think, between the different types of organizations. When I look at coming from the manufacturing industry, now in healthcare and previously in automotive, most of the supply base, maybe not by spend, but certainly by number of suppliers, are $100 million or less companies, right? And sometimes 10, 15, $20 million companies that don't have the investment to make in a lot of these digital tools. And so I think it is a little bit of a slower adoption. But the other thing I would echo that you said, Rahul, is the quality of your data has to be good. And I see a lot of companies starting to wake up to that and really focus on master data management and making sure that they have a way to capture, for example, country of origin, something so simple and foundational, but not always well captured in systems that we have. And that field alone can drive not just tax and tariff information, but also regionalization and how often you're shipping things back and forth. So the time for master data management is absolutely here, which I think will set companies up for better digitization for sure.
Yeah, data is the new oil, as they say. But one thing I wanted to pick up next was Carrie, the trend you were talking about there at the start, about all the different things that a procurement operation has in play at the same time. It's not just the cost, it's not just driving down the amount you're paying for things, you're thinking about the regulations and all of the things you went through at the start. What advice would you have on actually trying to balance those things? Because they're often competing with each other. The cheapest thing might not be the most sustainable.
Yeah, they are. And I think the most important thing that a company can start with is and it can just be as simple as an Excel tool, right? It doesn't have to be super fancy, but having a very clean way to quantify the total landed cost of something, not just the price, but the total landed cost. So taking inputs on logistics, having a weighter for sustainability, having a weight for supplier risk, looking at dual source, looking at tariffs and geopolitical, and just kind of putting it in one sheet. So when you're looking at sourcing a supplier, you can check all those elements and see what your trade-offs are going to be. It sounds very simple, but building out that model is I think foundational to making decisions that aren't gut feel or that aren't overly reliant on satisfying one of those elements. So I think that's where you need to start. How do you quantify each of those things? How do you know what your inventory levels are going to need to be if you offshore something versus if you localize it? Can you put numbers to that? Can you put numbers to the sustainability and build out a weighted model that will help you to a decision?
Rahul?
No, I think most points well covered by Carrie. I think for me in this, I think again the wake up call is that the speed of change I think has to become faster. I think many of the tools, technologies are now starting to be present. In my work with many of the organizations, and I was speaking to Carrie about it, we tend to sort of traverse organizations from automotive to FMCG to chemical, pharmaceutical. And I see that in most scenarios, one, obviously the evolution of different industries and their procurement organizations is different. I think sometimes we end up having sort of more siloed, like a pharmaceutical guys talking only to pharmaceutical guys, not talking to auto guys and things like that. I think there is a lot of learning across industries that need to happen. And the second thing is the primary issue in all of this technology adoption seems to be change management. So how do we sort of work on the people side of aspect that guys, we want to become smarter, we want to become faster, and that is just happening around us. I mean, like in every industry, the number of changes that are just happening is high. So we got to embrace it, we got to change it, and we got to move in that direction and learn from not just our industry peers, but also learn across industries, because the kind of JIT systems, for example, auto has evolved to, and the Toyota manufacturing, I mean, like those are applicable across industry. I mean, and we should not be sort of like, I think if somebody is doing something good, I mean, we should copy that. I mean, there's no reason to sort of be ashamed of copying good work of some other peer sets.
One thing I wanted to move on to next is measuring the ROI of any strategic changes that we've made, because change for the sake of change isn't always necessary. You want to be able to prove that it's actually worked. What suggestions would you have of actually effectively measuring what the ROI is of any strategic changes you might make?
Yeah, it's a great question. I talked a moment ago about having a good way to quantify the total landed cost, and I think that's one way that you can do that, because you can see your trade-offs of, okay, if I move something from China to Mexico, right? I'm going to lose on price, I'm going to gain on logistics, I'm going to gain on sustainability, and I may lose on packaging. I don't know. And so just being able to build out your ROI process in a more sophisticated way than we've done before. And then I think to Rahul's point too, not everything will have a clear ROI at first. And one of the things that I think gets in the way of long-term sustainable change in our supply chains is we react or think only to the quarter or the year. And we don't invest we look for a short-term ROI. And many of these things, investing in take a longer term ROI that would not normally meet a company's hurdles. And so I think there's a change that needs to happen at the executive levels and in the finance departments and just in the culture of companies, that a short-term ROI for some of the things that build out risk and sustainability, it's just not going to be there. And you've got to go outside of your normal hurdle process if you're truly going to invest.
Rahul, how do you go about actually measuring those ROIs if you've made a strategic change?
No, I think a fantastic point, and I think the way I think about, I think all of us are used to KPIs in the system, and I think many a times people limit yourself towards the cost element as a KPI, and I want to really emphasize the point that it is very, very important to start to define KPIs which are, for example, what is a sustainability index? And I could define parameters which are industry specific, and I would say that if I'm at sustainability index X in terms of how do I do circular economy concepts, or how do I do refurbish in terms of equipment, and sort of I define that sustainability index and I look at how am I progressing on that index. I could define an index which is purely in terms of risk index, country risk index, right? So am I sort of and that is, I think, very, very important, because otherwise there's a natural tendency towards a cost index, because that's probably like ends up being 90-95% of your thinking. But if you say like, I'm going to be like maybe 60-70% indexed on cost index, which can be defined by total cost optimization, which inventory to pricing to all of those related aspects. But then 30% of my KPIs are going to be around the sustainability risk. How am I prepared for the future in terms of my digitization, data readiness, because I got to become competitive for the year 2, because if my sort of peer set of companies are starting to have better data, they will make better decisions for year 2. And so I would say it is very, very important to start to have these metrics. So you have a cost index, which every company has. Define a sustainability index, which is around environment and what you want to do. Define an index on risk, that is very important. And then define an index which is purely on your readiness, digital readiness of the future, which is kind of, you might say, I'm at stage 1, I want to get my data set right, and therefore your index is data set. Once your data is right, you may start to have how much machine learning and AI tools you're using. So I think that's what will give a better perspective to a procurement guy versus a natural index to cost.
I'm going to go to some questions.
I love it. And I guess the fourth index, and I don't know how you build it out, right? But I think companies need to be—
I can tell you that.
That's true, you probably can. Is how do you factor in your revenue growth as a result of implementing these things, right? Because I think most companies are not thinking through from the customer back; they're thinking from their organization back when it comes to cost. And I spend a lot of time with my commercial teams, because they're very much interested in supply chain these days, as we all know, right? Talking to our customers about what we're doing in our supply chain, they're taking an interest like never before in sustainability, in resiliency, wanting to know that multi-tiers of their supply chain are paying attention to these things. So there's a difficult to quantify benefit of investing in being ahead of your competitors, because it's going to increase your revenue. How much? That's hard to quantify.
I'm going to ask you both in a moment about examples of strategic changes you've made, how you went about designing those changes, how successful they were, things you learned. I'll give you a moment to think on that, but I'm just going to go to questions from our audience that are starting to come in, which you do through the app, so do keep them coming in. This one is from Mike Silvio from Gibraltar Industries. This one's to you, Carrie. You've got experience in a very different industries and large companies, of course, automotive, medical, as we went through at the start. How has your supplier management strategy changed in that time, having worked across so many different sectors?
Thanks for the question, Mike. It's a good one, because I would say there's more the same than there is different if you really look at it. What's the same is you have to have strong relationships. You cannot think short term. You need to be pulling innovation out of your supply base. All of these things are common. What I think I've found different from industry to industry is when you go from something that is very high volume, low mix, there's a certain relationship that you can have with your suppliers where there's maybe more competition, or they may run your part on that same machine all year long, 24/7, and you can work with them a little bit differently. When you go to an industry like medical that tends to be more low volume, high mix, the planning and the complexity is so much more important that there's transparency on that. And you also tend to be with those suppliers for quite a long time, because making a change is difficult in a super highly regulated industry. So I think the fundamentals of how you work with suppliers doesn't change from industry to industry, but maybe some of the tactics and some of the planning needs to adjust.
That's a good way to look at it. Rahul, I'll put that question to you as well. You've obviously had a variety in your career as well. How have you seen those differences?
So firstly, I think for me, when I hear the word supply relationship management, I actually start to not like that statement. I like a statement which is rather supply relationship leadership. Because I think somewhere, if you are thinking about innovation and in a fast-paced world, I think we can't be sort of thinking about innovation that we do as an organization. We have to be thinking about how is my supplier doing innovation? How am I participating? How am I learning from him? How am I sort of encouraging him to do that as well? Because innovation is no longer going to be limited to an organization doing it. It is end-to-end supply chain which has to start innovating. And therefore, it's very important that just like when we are talking internally in our organization that tell me what is your revenue goals, tell me what is your strategic goals, all the index that I sort of spoke about. I think in my supply relationship conversation, I should be actually asking them, pushing them as to what are you doing, and tell me 3 ideas that you are innovating and which could feed into my procurement and supply chain. And I think that suddenly changes your conversation from a cost and a transactional relationship and kind of a customer supplier relationship to kind of a partner relationship in my mind, right? Because you're suddenly saying, and the guy may come back to Carrie's point, she pointed out that some of them may not have tools, capabilities, but the guy can articulate, guy or a gal can articulate, sorry, to be gender neutral there, but they could articulate that this is a area that I want to innovate, but I need to invest, and I might need commitment, I may need support, I may need training, and can you help me in that direction, right? So I think that to me is a real world. And if you start to create those kind of partners, and we saw it in one of the case studies where working with very large FMCG company globally, we manage almost $30 billion worth of spend through our platform. They went completely from kind of a management style to leadership style with their suppliers. And they had challenge in terms of use of technology. They had challenge in terms of, am I putting contracts on a quarterly, yearly basis, or can I do it on a weekly basis, things like that. So I think if you put your mind to it, suddenly with that change of word from management to leadership, and that innovation is not only internal to me as an organization, but my entire supplier ecosystem is part of innovating alongside with me and contributing towards it, I think it suddenly changes the perspective and how you operate with your suppliers.
We are getting more questions coming in from the audience. Thank you for those. We'll get to those in just a moment, but I did say I was going to push you both for some examples, and Rahul, you just provided us with one there, but I'll push you for one now. Can you go through an example where you've looked at the procurement operation and wanted to think, we want to be more strategic about this particular area? How did you go about tackling that and then working out whether it was a success or not?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a stab at that. One of the things that we're really focused on is on increasing dual sources, right? And you could tackle this 10 different ways, and it's hard to know which way to do it. You could look at, okay, I'm going to take my top spend items and say that I'm going to be 80% of my top 200 items. I'm going to make sure I'm dual sourced. But you could still be missing what, I'm sure we've heard in the industry called the golden screw, right? This very small dollar value part that goes across everything. So that's only one way to look at it. If you look at it as maybe a program, right? I'm going to take this product and make sure I take risk out of the product. You could do it that way. You could look at it regionally and say, I want a China plus one strategy. And this gets back to really trying not to boil the ocean. Pick something, start there, get a win. And so I think that's key to measuring your successes is know that no one approach is perfect and you can't do them all at the same time, but really build yourself a multi-year roadmap and start with your measurements of success as how you're doing along that roadmap that you built.
Rahul?
Yeah, I would take an interesting example. I think we were working with one of the largest mining company in India, and we were working with them on with the procurement guys on cost optimization and things like that. And it was a complex system. It was kind of a $50 million to $100 million spend, but we realized working with them, depending on the level of the person within the organization, suddenly you saw that there was a shift between a transactional approach to optimization versus a strategic approach to optimization. Because in the value chain for them, the fundamental things were broken. Forecasting was broken. Lead times of suppliers were broken. Inventory management was broken. Data was broken. And the digitization was broken. So all 5 things were broken. And if you were just unless you kind of stitch together a solution which could fix all of that, data, digitization, how do you do forecasting, how do you do inventory management, and then make sure that the reliability, risk, all of those elements are done, you actually can't solve that problem. And therefore, at a point, we had to step back and we said, either we are going to do it all, or we are not going to touch it, because something or the other will be broken and that will not generate a great experience. So I sometimes feel that there are places where you want to go in and say, I want to do step 1, and then based on that success, take step 2, 3, 4. But counter to that, we have in this particular case and many cases, we have started to encounter that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 broken. And unless you clearly have a roadmap that I want to fix 1, 2, 3, 4 in this sequence and do it, you will not change the system. So, so I'm more and more bullish that you need to start it with a little bit of a zoom out approach of where do you want to go, and then make sure that you are starting to fix every single piece to get in a zoom out world where you want to get to as an organization, because there are more systemic issues, because everyone down the chain is optimizing for their own spot changes versus looking at the holistic picture.
No, that is good advice, and we've got advice being sought by our audience. Thank you for sending the questions in. This one comes from Praveen. How can you strategize procurement processes in scale-ups when there's little capital for large investments in software? Carrie, is this going back to what you said about you don't have to be overly fancy, you just need to have a plan, you need to have a solution?
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes that a lot of organizations make is they jump to a IT tool without having thought through the processes. And so they just automate waste. And the first and best thing that you can do is think through what you want your process to be, what you want your decision tree to look like, what are the elements of that strategy, be very clear about it, and then the digital tools support it. So that's my take on that. And I think the other thing that's important, no matter what size company you are, is that you're very thoughtful about getting cross-functional buy-in to your strategy. Your strategy for supply chain has to support your business strategy, right? And that sounds very simple, but there's often a disconnect there. So really making sure that you think from the customer back, how is what I'm going to do at the end of the day solve the customer's problem? And so being very thoughtful about that end-to-end, as Rahul mentioned, strategy. It's not a supply chain strategy, it's end-to-end business strategy, and your supply chain strategy needs to support the rest.
Yes, having that clarity. Rahul, anything you'd add to that?
No, I think the only thing, because it seemed like a startup specific question, I think there is I am a big fan of this big rock, small rock, sand and water. I think sometimes depending on the journey as a startup, you're trying to fix your business model, product market fit, you might have capital access. So depending on the stage and the amount of inefficiency that might be in the organization, you also got to be clear that you may not be able to optimize everything to the T that you want to, and you have to just be kind enough to yourself sometimes for being suboptimal. I mean, there is in a fast-growing organization, sometimes you got to live with certain inefficiencies if you have bigger rocks to solve and as a company. So don't be too hard on yourself if you're not able to optimize it on day one.
Well, Rahul, that leads me on perfectly to where I wanted to go next. And when we are analysing whether these strategies have worked, because we put them in place to improve something, how important is it to be honest with yourself about the success of something? It could have been a wonderful strategy that a lot of people worked on, and it might not have worked. It might not be exactly what you hoped it would achieve. How important is it that we're honest with ourselves when we're reviewing the success of projects?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just talking about this yesterday with someone. Is extremely important, and we've all heard the term, right? Fail fast. And I think when you're making these kinds of investments, either in strategy or IT tools, you do need to take stock all along the way. Is this needle moving or not? But there's also that balance that I talked about of a tendency to look to short-term results. And a lot of these strategic initiatives are not going to be short-term results. So you've got to really balance, is it working with, do I need to do it? And am I getting it 80% correct? And we're going to refine it as we go. So it's a balance, but you have to have those honest conversations often.
Rahul?
I am a big believer that you have to look yourself in the mirror all the time. I think that is, and you should not lie to yourself, because you can sort of, it's just dangerous for an organization which lies to itself, right? So I think it is okay. Sometimes you may set goals which you may underestimate. It may take longer to sort of achieve those goals, or sometimes during the process you may identify that was not the right goal to set, and how do I want to improve on that. So I'm a big fan of both agility on one extreme, where if it was the wrong goal to define in the first place, I mean, maybe we correct it. And the second thing is, if it was not achieved, underestimated, how do you improve upon it? So I think that improvement mindset, agility mindset, but making sure that you're heading in the right direction is super important. And you just can't lie to yourself, I think, neither as individual, neither as an organization.
Now, Carrie, you mentioned the fabled golden screw earlier, which is already one of my favourite quotes of today. The golden screw of any strategy, I suppose, is the data, because it lets you make informed decisions. What advice would you have of trying to make sure the data is of a high quality and is genuinely useful to back up the strategy you've put together?
Yeah, I cannot understate the importance of that. You know, one of the things that I know we're struggling with, as many companies are, is how do you map your sub-tier supply chain, right? Typically, that golden screw is not in your direct supply base. It's 2-3 tiers down. And so it can be very difficult to identify that. And I think the first thing that companies need to be thinking about is, how do I visualize what my sub-tiers look like? Certainly there's manual ways to do it. Most of us are doing it manually now, but there are a lot of companies that are starting to build out supply chain mapping software. What does that look like? Finding the golden screw in advance is the key and the challenge. But to do so, you have to understand all of your sub-tier supplier relationships.
Rahul, how do you get that data right?
I would say that it's a hard problem, but I also think it requires a fresh perspective, because I think just doing more of the same, I think will probably not get there. And I think, again, I'm a big fan, of consumer companies, how companies like Moglix, I think we are almost like a smaller version of Amazon. How do you continue to sort of learn about the suppliers, make them accountable for their data as well, because this approach of a central database manager, I think, is a very old school approach of because you will never have infinite resources to map out your suppliers and the suppliers of theirs and things like that, right? So I think it is very, very important that you start to have collective participation of the stakeholders and with the right incentive to kind of map out the entire supply chain ecosystem. And I think that is essential, because if you just keep doing this more of the same, I don't think we'll sort of get to the answer that we want to. And therefore, I mean, if you take consumer commerce companies, I think they manage, like we manage 20,000 plus suppliers, we manage 1 million plus SKUs. Obviously, there are larger e-commerce companies which manage 50, 100 million SKUs as well, I think. And they are able to do it effectively, both in terms of cataloging, both in terms of supplier management, things like that. So I think that concept of internet companies need to come into traditional procurement organizations, because without that step change, I think we'll 5 years out, we'll still talk about the same problem. And it would not go away, because it just requires completely a little bit of disruption sometimes is helpful, and it just needs to happen if you want to go there.
Well, Rahul, we'll pick this conversation up in 5 years then, see if that same problem is still existing or whether we've solved it yet. Rahul and Carrie, thank you so much for joining us here today at Procurement and Supply Chain Live New York. Really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for having us, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of the event.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Indeed.